So it's my true pleasure to be here. And what I'm going to do is talk about a new book of mine, which will come out in May of next year, Power and Progress, and it's co-authored with Simon Johnson. This is, I was on leave last year, so that's, if I wonder where my leave went, this is where it went. So what is this book about? Why did we write this book? We live in the age of techno-optimism, even as people complain about social media, possible negative effects of artificial intelligence, and other social ills that may be brought by new technologies. There is tremendous excitement and a widespread belief that we are in the most innovative age, and these innovations, if shepherded right, are going to improve, even solve some of the thorniest questions that humanity has faced: pandemics, climate change, poverty, and everything else. Economists are not immune to this. We tend to look at technology, for good reason, with a sort of positive glow. After all, technological improvement for economists is an expansion of what we can do, and if we expand what we can do, we should be able to do better. All of these optimistic beliefs have some empirical backing. Indeed, today we are tremendously healthier, wealthier, and better off than people who lived 400, 500 years ago, and technological change, innovativeness of entrepreneurs, scientists, has a great deal to do with it. And it is indeed true that the number of new products, new patents has skyrocketed. Today, there are as many patents filed as 5 times as many patents filed today as there was 40 years ago in the United States. The increase is even larger in other countries. But over the last decade or more, I have become convinced that there are many aspects of this techno-optimism that are misplaced. And in fact, looking at history helps us understand where that misplacement may come from and what should replace it, perhaps. A more positive attitude towards technology that's based on who controls technology and how we can control it in a more democratic way. And this book is an outgrowth of my research and thinking on those matters. And to give you a flavor, and as I said, the subtitle of the book is Our 1,000-Year Struggle Over Technology and Prosperity. History is an important part of it. So let me start from one specific historical episode, but we could have picked many, and several are discussed in the book. In 1791, somebody most economists have heard of, Jeremy Bentham, who was an economist as well as a philosopher, proposed the panopticon as an efficiency-enhancing monitoring system. In a well-lit circular building, a centrally placed guard station can monitor people, prisoners in this case, without explicitly being seen by the prisoners. And this was viewed by Bentham as a great innovation that would improve things. In fact, panopticon was not dreamt up by Bentham himself, or not by Jeremy Bentham. It was originally his brother's idea, Samuel Bentham, who was a naval engineer working for the Tsar in St. Petersburg. And he came up with it as an idea for factory monitoring. He thought that workers need to be monitored so that they did the right thing, and he proposed it. Samuel Bentham's idea went nowhere, and a decade later, Jeremy Bentham picked it up and saw the greater applicability of it. For example, he wrote, "You will be surprised when you come to see the efficacy of this simple and seemingly obvious contrivance promises to be to the business of schools, manufactories, prisons, even hospitals." The panopticon has remained in the public imagination thanks to philosophers such as Michel Foucault or movies like The Guardians of the Galaxy. But its more important role is really as a symbol of how many of the late 18th, early 19th century philosophers and thinkers in Britain, the heart of industrialization, thought about technology. To Bentham, this was clearly in the name of progress. New technologies such as the panopticon will expand the capabilities that would bring better outcomes because it enables us to do things that we couldn't do before. How could you be against it? In fact, Jeremy Bentham's philosophy was very much based on this notion. Utilitarianism was, yes, sure, somebody may lose out from new technology or a reform, but as long as there are sufficient winners out of it, we should sum up their gains versus losses, and something like the panopticon that expands what we do is going to be in the public interest. In this, Bentham was not alone. Much more important for the discipline of economics was Adam Smith. And even though Adam Smith was not actually completely into the industrialization process, even though as he was writing, British industrialization was raging ahead, he did comment on some of the key issues of industrialization. And one that occupied people before Adam Smith, during Adam Smith's time, and since then, is whether new technologies that increase productivity would be good for workers. And Adam Smith worried about a very modern preoccupation that we have, something that we would call, I'm going to call this automation. You reduce the labor requirements by using machinery for performing tasks that was previously performed. And he said, well, could that be a bad thing for labor? By better machinery, greater dexterity, and a more proper division of distribution of work, that's going to reduce the amount of labor. But no worries, he said. Flourishing circumstances, which means everybody's going to do well, should ultimately lead to the real price of labor rising considerably. David Ricardo, the other founder of modern economics, was of the same view as well originally. He wrote it in the first and second edition of the Principles of Economics, his monumental book. He testified or gave speeches in Parliament to the same extent. But interestingly, David Ricardo, a little bit like the sort of what we're talking about here, started having second thoughts, and he changed his tune by adding a chapter to the third edition of the Principles of Economics. And he wrote to a friend saying, if machinery could do all the work that labor now does, there would be no demand for labor, and that would be not a good outcome. Modern thinking in policymaking circles and among economists, I think by and large agrees with Adam Smith or Bentham. Many of our approaches, conceptual frameworks that we use, have the consequence that when productivity increases, that generally benefits most people. Inequality might rise. Some people may benefit more than others. Erasmus may get 20% rise. I might get 10%. But at the end of the day, there are forces in most of our models such that everybody becomes a beneficiary. In the most standard models, that would be because, for example, the share of output that goes to capital and labor is constant. But if you go beyond that, those share might not be constant. But again, there are enough assumptions imposed in that, which is both an empirical and a theoretical matter, that real price of labor, wages should increase. Now, that's the theory, and that's the belief. Very little sympathy would be given by most policymakers and economists if you question that technological improvements may not actually bring widespread benefits. It is quite widely held in economics, so widely held that it actually doesn't have a name. So Simon and I had to come up with a name, and we call it the productivity bandwagon. Productivity increases, and it's like a bandwagon, it pulls everybody together with it. And if you believe in the productivity bandwagon, you should worry about inequality, and people do. You should worry about disruption. So perhaps productivity will improve and the bandwagon will work, but it might be slow acting. So you might be worried about disruptions, that favorite word of Silicon Valley, but ultimately things should work out. And that is captured by research articles, policymaker statements, but succinctly by the co-founder of LinkedIn and PayPal, Reid Hoffman. Could we have bad 20 years? Yes, absolutely. But if we are working towards progress, your future will be better than the present. And your here doesn't mean you in Silicon Valley. Your future, everybody. Now, as the British Industrial Revolution was raging, and Bentham and Adam Smith had this positive view of technological change and the transformation that it was bringing, workers did not share that optimism. We know quite a lot about what the workers thought because Britain was a fairly literate society. People wrote a lot of petitions. Democracy was already active in Britain for part of this period. I'll talk more about democracy in Britain later in the talk. And there were also Royal Commission reports that went and interviewed workers. workers incessantly complained. They were not happy about industrialization. They thought that in the name of progress, a lot of things were being imposed on them and they weren't quite happy with them. Working conditions, factory discipline, factory organization were among their main complaints. No man would like to work in a power loom. They do not like it. There is such clattering and noise, it would almost make some men mad. Next, he would have to subject to a discipline that a handloom weaver could never submit to. This was a common refrain. The discipline, the monitoring, what Bentham, Samuel and Jeremy thought was so great, workers completely hated it. And they linked their plight to the factory system, but especially to what I just called automation. For example, another one of the weavers said, I am determined for my part that if they will invent machines to supersede manual labor, they must find iron boys to mind them. Data is not completely clear, but if anything is on the side of the workers. There is some debate. There are measurement issues going back that far, especially if you want to measure real wages. But by all accounts, if you look at the real incomes of British industrial workers, from around 1750, when the Industrial Revolution started, to around 1840, there is no increase in their real incomes. If you look at their working hours, there is an increase of about 20%. And working conditions worsen, so amenities worsen. So by all accounts, the workers were right. Their real hourly wages declined, their working conditions deteriorated, and this is not counting the fact that they became concentrated in cities where infectious diseases were rampant, living conditions, pollution were horrible, their living quarters were much worse. So certainly 90 years does not sound like a short disruption period. And why did things change? I'll come back to that. But I want to emphasize, before I come back to some of these issues in some more systematic fashion, that this was not an isolated incident. You do not need to look far and wide to find many other technological transitions of completely transformative effects where large groups of workers, especially workers, ended up worse off as a result of new technologies that enriched a significant fraction of the population. A whole series of technological improvements revolutionized medieval agriculture. So when you look at it from the view of technology, the medieval period was not a dark age. But if you look at it from the viewpoint of the workers, the peasants, it was a dark age. There was very little improvements in real living standards, despite the fact that productivity probably doubled during those several hundred years. Advances in European ship design were completely revolutionary. They were the ones that enabled the Atlantic trade, the discoveries of all different new sea routes and major trade voyages. But at the same time, these ships were used most intensively for shipping over a million enslaved people from Africa to the New World. The introduction of steam engine was the other driver of early British industrialization, together with the handloom, the power looms, the weaving and spinning machines, textile machinery that I mentioned previously. But the steam engines, though later became the heart of heavy industry and railways, early on they were used mostly for pumping out water from deep mines. As steam engines started being used and improved tremendously, for example, by James Watt and others, that enabled mine owners to dig much deeper into coal mines. But who would go that deep into the coal mines? Well, it turned out it would be children as young as 5 years old working for over 15 hours in incredibly dangerous situations. Certainly these children, who became about 30 to 40% of the workforce of many mines, were not winners from this technological improvement. The cotton gin, coming closer to the United States, completely revolutionized the US economy. US was not a major cotton producer, became the largest cotton producer, largest cotton exporter, completely enriched many different parts of the United States that were economic backwaters, but it led to a horrible intensification of slavery with the cotton plantation system. Many other examples of this type of transitions can be put on the table. But these are not just of historical importance. I would claim that we are actually living through one of them. Despite the mesmerizing technological changes that you read about, and in fact you experience as educated, relatively privileged people in the world, in the United States, actually the labor market implications of many of these technologies have been much more mixed. The United States has experienced a historically unprecedented shift against labor. The share of national income that goes to labor used to hover between 66, 67, 68%, around 70% sometimes. It has been on a downward trend over the last 40 years, especially over the last 20 years, it has fallen by 10 percentage points. So much, much more of labor, of overall national income goes to capital and much less to labor. But even more consequentially, what goes to labor has become extremely unequally distributed. And this figure summarizes that by showing you the evolution of real weekly wages for 10 demographic groups, going all the way from workers with less than a high school degree, in dark red, all the way up to workers with a postgraduate degree, master's, PhD, JD, and so on, in dark blue, and that separately for men and women. What you see here, starting in 1963, you have about a 15-year period or over 10-year period where real wages for these 10 demographic groups are growing in tandem, a period of rising tide lifting all boats. It's not special to 1963. That's when the high-quality data starts, but you can extend it back to 1945, and you see exactly the same pattern for another 20 years. So the post-war period of about 35 years was an era of broadly and remarkably shared rapid growth, and it was very unusual in terms of how rapid it was. Real wages for low education workers overall increased close to 3% a year for about a 35-year in real terms. But then, starting sometime in the late 1970s, early 1980s, you have a complete sea change. You see the top and the bottom fanning out. A big gap is opening between the dark blue and the red or the orange. Orange is for workers with a high school degree. But even more remarkably, workers with low education, including even those in gray who have associate degrees, less than 4-year college degrees, but not 4-year college degrees, are actually experiencing significant declines in their real wages. About 1% every 2 years for for men with less than high school, for example. It's a remarkable, unprecedented period. The United States is a leader in inequality, but it's not the only country. If you look at an omnibus measure of inequality, say the Gini coefficient, it has increased pretty much in all of the Western world, though very few other places have experienced the type of declines at the bottom, because the United States is also distinguished by the fact that it has no minimum wages, it does not have much collective bargaining, and social norms against inequality, for example, in workplaces are much weaker than in continental Europe. The parallels don't end with the inequality trends. If you look at what's been going on with middle class, the middle class has been in retreat in pretty much all industrialized world. And this figure summarizes those trends across countries by looking at the types of jobs that are available in the markets across different countries. And so what this figure does is that it classifies all jobs, all occupations into high wage, low wage, and middle class occupations. High wage ones would be management consultants, engineers, economists, technical occupations. Low wage ones would be security, food preparation, homework, and so on. The middle class ones, is about a third of the population, is blue collar work, clerical, back office work, and so on. So in red, you see that they have been becoming much and much less common in all of these industrialized nations. Now, if the productivity bandwagon doesn't work, or it's extremely weak and slow acting, that might change your views about technology. But the biggest change in perspective would come if you realize one other thing, which is often underemphasized, not ignored completely, but underemphasized in public discussions or even in academic debates. Choice over technology. When you hear technological leaders, there is an implicit notion that there is a direction, a path of progress that we have to follow, and not much uncertainty about what that path is. For example, we have to double down on AI because the future is AI. But throughout history, when you look at it, technology is not a determinate path. It's an extremely malleable set of ideas. We have a common knowledge as humans. That's what distinguishes us from our closest relatives, our ability to take shared knowledge. But the direction in which you take that shared knowledge and develop it is extremely flexible. What that means is that there is a tremendous amount of choice over which path of technology we take. And different paths may have very different distributional implications. Some may benefit me, some may harm me. If the productivity bandwagon was powerful, then even those that initially harm me, ultimately it would self-correct because the productivity bandwagon would pull me together with it. But if you have choice and a weak productivity bandwagon, then things are much more problematic. So why would we not believe in the productivity bandwagon? After all, I told you that in many models that you have seen in your classes, the productivity bandwagon is there, even if it's not emphasized, though it is often so apparent that many of you will have internalized its lessons. Well, there are several reasons, but two of them are particularly important. One is exactly what the British Industrial Revolution workers realized: automation. Automation is sometimes used in many different ways, but I'm going to use it in a specific sense, which many economists adopt, which is automation is about the process of machinery, capital, algorithms, taking away tasks that were previously performed by labor. It is automation that the weavers were complaining about because they were the ones who were skilled artisans doing the hand-loom weaving, previously the spinning, receiving high wages. And the early stage breakthroughs in British Industrial Revolution was about mechanizing or putting machinery in place of those artisans. Robots, the path of AI that we are on, are all examples of automation. Automation has always been with us, and in principle there's nothing wrong with automation. But automation does not produce a very powerful productivity bandwagon. Why not? For a very simple reason, that automation is about displacing workers from the tasks that they used to perform. So it does not generate the same type of productivity gains that other technological improvements does. And I'm going to try to explain this in a little bit more detail. If, again, there was a definite path of technology that we had to follow, and that path went unabashedly through automation, perhaps that's the only thing we can do. But automation is not the only thing that technology does, and post-war prosperity that I showed you, as I'm going to explain, was not created just by automation. It was created by other technological improvements that squarely increase worker productivity, as I will explain. Second, what economists call rent sharing. When firms make profits, how well are they shared with their workers? Well, it might be that firms make profits and at the same time push wages down even further. Think of what goes on in Foxconn, for example. That's amazingly productive, amazingly important for the world system, but Foxconn workers are not getting much wage increases. The 35, 40 years of shared prosperity was a period when firms made profits, those got shared with their workers. But the medieval agriculture, which I mentioned, was the opposite. When the mills were introduced or horses were introduced into agriculture, rather than share the gains with the peasants, what the lords did actually, they intensified coercion. In fact, workers ended up worse off in many of these circumstances. So these are ideas that are, when I explain, somewhat plausible, but are not the ones that many of you may be familiar with. So let me actually put a little bit more flesh on those bones and try to explain what I mean, especially focusing on the automation. So here is one way of thinking of the production process, a little bit more micro than what you may have seen in some of your courses. Think of the process of producing a piece of garment. To do that, you need to perform a large number of tasks. You have to start with taking fibers out, spinning, carding, then a whole host of weaving processes. Then you need some design. Then based on the design and the exact weaving finishing, you need to do a whole host of chemical processes, coloring, dyeing, drying, and so on. And that's just the production side, and then a whole host of non-production tasks related to getting that garment to the consumers. It's only when all of these tasks are performed that a piece of clothing gets completed and delivered to consumers. A key decision is how to perform these tasks, and in particular, which factors of production are going to perform these tasks. So let me simplify things and think of just two types of factors, capital and labor. And here I have drawn it just in one specific way. The exact shape of these curves don't matter, but in blue I'm showing you the cost of producing these tasks with labor. In orange I'm showing it in the cost of producing these, the relevant task by capital. And I have put a threshold there, I. That's the threshold beyond which you do not technologically know how to automate tasks. So if you are in 1750, you do not know how to do the spinning by capital. That knowledge is not there. Okay? Then the firm's cost minimization problem is very simple. Choose the lower envelope. Follow the orange line, which is below the blue line, up to the point I, and after that you have no choice, go to the blue line. Now using this figure, let's ask ourselves, what is technological progress here? And this will enable me to explain both why I'm saying technological progress is a choice and is malleable, because there's a set of very different ways of improving technology, and you'll see that they're going to have very different implications. So here is the one that we do most commonly in economic models. We think of technological change as increasing labor's productivity. So if that happens, the cost of producing any given task with labor goes down because labor has become more productive. That's what technology has enabled. When that happens, now you see in this figure, you see a very peculiar pattern. You get a big area shown in blue, which is the productivity improvement. And you do not get any change in the allocation of tasks to factors. No displacement of workers. In general, there might be some, but it's going to be second order. So what this means is that you have a big productivity improvements and no major first order distributional effects. And as a result, what you're going to get is we produce more, and that's going to get shared, especially if labor markets are competitive. If labor markets are not competitive, there is issues of coercion or firms driving a hard bargain, not clear. But with competitive labor markets, that blue area is going to translate into higher wages. That's the basis of the productivity bandwagon in many of the models that we use. If instead of labor becoming more productive, if capital became more productive, same thing. You would get big improvement, now shown in red, and no first order displacement. But none of this corresponds to automation. This is not what the workers in the late 18th, early 19th century were complaining in Britain. So here is what automation looks like. I shifts to I prime. Now you get two very different things. First, you have a direct displacement. A lot of workers now are thrown out of their work in the same way that the handloom weavers were by the technologies that they were complaining about. This doesn't just adversely affect them, it adversely affects all labor, because then they're going to go and try to take other jobs. So this will depress wages. Now, productivity improvements, what Bentham and Adam Smith were counting on, might come to the rescue. But the problem is, with automation, you get a small productivity improvement. Automation is critical, but by itself wouldn't necessarily give huge productivity improvements. So it's this little area. In fact, I can make that as little as you want by bringing the orange and the blue curves closer together. Now, if not automation, what was driving the rapid wage increases over the 1945-1975 period? Well, other technological changes, certainly things that made capital and labor more productive, but much more important, my research points out, were actually new tasks. If you look at what a lot of the people around you perform today, many of those occupations didn't exist. Management consultants, radiologists, app developers, designers. Even people like us, professors, most of the things that we do today did not exist 40, 50, 60 years ago. about 60% of jobs that are created in the US economy today are in tasks that did not exist 45, 50 years ago. So these new tasks are critical because they create new things to do productively for labor. So now you see the contrast. Automation, yes, an important part of technological progress, but it's just one part of technological progress. And it has very different distributional implications than other things that are more worker-friendly, such as new tasks. Well, now, what this says is that actually, if this picture is right, differently from the more optimistic view that things that improve productivity are going to generate trickle-down benefits for a broad range of people, we might have a much more distributionally skewed impact from some of the defining technologies of the age. In the extreme, we might see, again, according to this theory, you may, not necessarily, it will depend on the details, but you may see quite revolutionary technologies that increase productivity, that increase profits, but at the same time make workers worse off. Lower wages, lower employment. So is that really possible? Let's look at one of the most defining technologies for industrialized manufacturing over the last 40 years, industrial robots. They have completely revolutionized many heavy industries from electronics, metals, chemical, petrochemicals, and especially car manufacturing. Productivity improvements in car manufacturing have been largely driven in the United States, South Korea, Japan, Germany by robotization. So have they generated broad-based benefits for workers as well? So in a paper with Pasquale Restrepo, what we do is we look at the local effects of robots. So we look at 722 local labor markets in the United States. And for each labor market, we look at what sort of industries they specialized in, and then we use data on, from an engineering or from an advances point of view, which are the industries where robots have made most advances. It's almost all in manufacturing. There has been a lot of automation in non-manufacturing, but not with industrial robots, more with software and other advanced technologies. So for now, this is more driven by industrial manufacturing sectors. On the basis of this, we construct a measure of exposure to robots, meaning how much of the jobs in a local economy were exposed to automation by robots. It turns out that indeed, the more exposed to robots you are, the more robots were adopted in the local economy. So now let's look at the effects of this on workers. So on the horizontal axis, I have this exposure to robots measure. On the vertical axis, I have a change in employment in the local area. This is all before the Great Recession, so that it's not the financial crisis that interferes with it, but it's the same pattern if you extend the data to 2020. What you see is a strong negative association. The size of the circles is how big these different areas are, and some on the right you will recognize as the industrial heartland of the United States. Lansing City, Michigan, Detroit, Wilmington, Defiance City, Ohio, and so on. These are emblematic of what has happened to heavy industry employment. Employment in these industries and employment in these local areas has declined quite significantly. But this line is not driven by these outlying observations. If you get rid of them, you get the dashed line instead of the solid line. And it's not just employment. Local wages have declined even more sizably. So on the vertical axis now, I have log hourly wages of workers after adjusting for composition. You see that in places where there have been more robot adoption, local wages have declined quite significantly. It's not just capital versus labor, employment and wages. Inequality, the thing that I showed you in that first figure with the fanning out and the low education workers losing real incomes, that's really what's going on of the distribution of labor income. So who have been the losers out of this process of automation? Well, if you look at the effects, you see that the negative effects concentrate on the already low-paid workers. So workers below the median have been the ones who have suffered. Now, this is just robots. Robots are important for industry, but manufacturing employment was already, just above 10% at the beginning of this process. And a lot of automation in the US economy takes place in offices. That's what IBM originally targeted. Microsoft and other software was very much in the business of office-based processes. So for that, Pasquale Restrepo and I developed a different strategy looking at the national economy and not just robots, but all sorts of different automation. And I'll give you just one summary of it in one figure. So what this figure does is that it looks at 500 demographic groups. So they are more finely divided than what I showed you in that first figure with 10 groups. So now they are distinguished by age, education, gender, ethnicity. And on the horizontal axis, what you have is measuring the tasks that these different demographic groups performed in 1980, depending on which industries and which occupations they worked in. And then looking at data of which of tasks have been automated since then using specialized software, various different types of machinery and robots. And that is what's plotted on the horizontal axis. So for example, that big square there is workers with less than high school, and for them about 30% of the tasks they used to perform in 1980 have now been automated. On the vertical axis, I have the changes in real wages for these different demographic groups. You see the zero line? Many of these groups are below the zero line. Why? Because you saw in that first figure, many groups have actually lost real wages since 1980. But what you can see is a striking relationship where the more tasks you used to perform that have been automated, the lower is your real wages or real wage growth. And in fact, almost all of the groups that have lost real wages since 1980 are those that have relinquished a lot more tasks to software and machinery. Just this single variable by itself, or when combined with others, explains about 70% of what goes on between group inequality in the United States. But what's going on here? If inequality is so much fanned by automation, how come we had stable inequality before? After all, as I told you, automation is as old as industrialization. It was very rapid in the 18th century, early 19th century. Well, to answer that question, let's look at some estimates of what types of technologies the US economy was adopting. Now, here you have to make some more assumptions than the other figures that I showed you, and let me not go into the details of that. But what I will say is that this is looking at the first 4 decades after the end of World War II, and in red, you are seeing the displacement created by automation, and in blue, you are seeing the reinstatement created by new tasks, new, more worker-friendly technologies. And everything is in terms of labor share changes. So that's one metric that you can look at. So what you see is that there is a lot of displacement going on in those decades. And in fact, the fact that this is going down to -20 means that if there was no other technological change counterbalancing automation, labor share would have declined by 20% during those 40 years. But of course, that's not what happened. And the data say that's not what happened because there was other technological changes creating all these new tasks that I mentioned that counterbalance the effects of automation. That's true in the whole economy. It's true in manufacturing. Now, fast forward to the more recent period, and you'll see a very different picture. The red curve now goes down much faster, and the blue curve flattens out. So what has happened, and as a proximate cause I would submit of what we are seeing in terms of inequality declines in labor share, is that we have been doing much more automation and much less of other things that are more beneficial to labor. So in other words, it is the choice aspect of technology that has shifted, and in the absence of the productivity bandwagon that is so powerful, its distributional consequences have remained and have become permanent. Now, productivity growth can still save us. If we have amazing productivity growth, perhaps the bottom can be lifted. That's exactly what the theory says. If you have a lot of automation and very, very rapid productivity growth, well, we'll have an inequality, labor share will go down, but at least we'll pull workers together with us. So a weak form of the productivity bandwagon. But here is the problem. Even though we are told every day that we live in the best, most innovative, and most amazing time, according to the measures that most economists use, total factor productivity growth or other measures that zero in on the impacts of these new technologies on the macroeconomy, we're actually going through one of the worst periods of productivity growth. So TFP growth has been much slower during the last 3 decades than it was in the 50s, 60s, 70s, even 30s and 40s. So I would say what we are seeing today is not something we can make sense of with just techno-optimism, because it is something about the direction of technology. And it is about a direction of technology that is going in a path that is not broadly beneficial. It is creating tremendous wealth for people who are shepherding that technology, tech entrepreneurs, a few companies. Those gains are spreading to a class of very skilled workers, designers, computer scientists, AI specialists, management consultants, economists perhaps, lawyers. But they are not trickling down to a large fraction of the population. Now, one retort you might have, but people were saying the same things in the 1800s, and look at what happened. We did build shared prosperity in the second part of the 19th century, and we did have these amazing advances that I started by emphasizing at the beginning that makes us tremendously healthier, wealthier, and happier than people who lived under much harsher conditions 300 years ago. So perhaps we just have to wait and be patient. But again, if you look at history, you'll see that that's not the right interpretation. There was nothing automatic about the harsh conditions of early industrialization being reversed. So the last thing I want to do then is to reinterpret industrialization and shed some light on our current predicament from the industrialization. The early stages of industrialization, as I said, were impoverishing and really harsh for many groups. Child labor was endemic under completely awful conditions. Work hours expanded, work conditions deteriorated. The casualties of progress were widespread. And they cannot be understood without recognizing the institutional political context and the nature of technology. The nature of technology was completely focused on automation and cutting labor costs. That's why monitoring and supervision that excited Samuel and Jeremy Bentham was so important. And it was in a period, in an institutional setting where the workers could not organize. Until 1832, British electorate consisted of very, very privileged aristocrats. From 1832, middle classes were included, but it wasn't until for another 80 years that working classes would get the vote. Being a member of the trade union trade organization was illegal and was persecuted very heavily under various different laws. There were Masters and Servant Acts in effect until 1877, which made it a crime for workers to quit their employers. So all of the cards were stacked against workers. Yes, by the second half of the 19th century, things started changing. Real wages improved. Working conditions improved. Child labor was removed. Cesspools that had become, the British cities such as Manchester, London, Nottingham, that had become complete cesspools, the worst health conditions anywhere in the world, were all cleaned up. But there was nothing automatic about this. This was part of a redirection of technological change and a political process. Redirection of technological change was the automation focus gave way to a much different focus. Railways, for example, became a very dynamic industry, but railways had developed a very different way of thinking about labor. Originally, they tried to go with the same low-wage path that textile mills went, but they found that didn't work, and they started paying much higher wages to their workers to motivate them to create worker loyalty, attract the right kind of workers. Heavy industry invested much more in worker training. Very importantly, an idea that economic historians discussed a while ago American technology went in a very different direction even earlier than the British technology. And the reason for that is because America was in the grip of very acute shortage of skilled labor. So American engineers, American innovators from the early days put a great emphasis on increasing worker productivity, especially the productivity of low-skilled workers who could be trained and combined with machinery. And that American path then very quickly translated into a European technology through idea exchange and foreign direct investment. But equally critical as the path of technology was the institutional path. Democratization, worker organization, and all of the political changes empowered workers to ask better working conditions and better wages. Now, this was a very difficult process. It did not at one fell swoop bring shared prosperity. But over time, both in the US and in Europe, more and more investments in increasing worker productivity started being made, even as automation was going on quite rapidly. For example, Ford's factories in the early 20th century were emblematic of this, that they introduced very advanced machinery, some of it actually automated work, but at the same time, also, they were very high-wage places by the standards of the time because they made very extensive use of low-skilled workers. Most workers in the United States were well-educated by European standards, but still very low skill. With the right training, combine them with machinery. At the same time, there was also a tremendous expansion of clerical workers, much more measurement, design, maintenance, repair, and planning. All of these were at the heart of the wage growth and the creation of new tasks. And it was this process that really led to this very rapid output and TFP growth that I showed you in that previous figure. Unions were an important part of it. Sometimes they stood unproductively in the path of technology. But during the more productive interactions between employers and employees, which unfortunately was not often in the United States, unions understood that what they should do wasn't to block technology, but to steer the direction of technology. So for example, there were many standstills between GM and Ford and the United Auto Workers. And the ones that led to better outcomes were those where United Auto Workers said, we're not against technology, but we want technology so we steered in a direction that's going to help worker productivity. And they pushed companies to invest more in training and create more and more skilled jobs for their workers. Now, all of this became much harder after 1980. Why? Well, I will conclude by providing one interpretation of what happened. As the data I showed you highlights, you cannot make sense of what happened from 1980 onward without digital technologies. Other factors were important. But the fact that automation played such a role, as I showed you, means that digital technologies, which were at the heart of automation, have to be a very important part of the story. But again, is that because digital technologies had to go in an automation direction? No. In fact, early pioneers of computers had a very different vision than where digital technologies went. In places such as MIT or Berkeley, San Francisco, there was a whole group of young computer scientists who thought that computers would be the most liberating technology. They argued that they were extremely opposed to corporations such as IBM, who they said, their approach was designed by geniuses for use by idiots. And that was exactly the wrong approach, because computers would be exactly the kind of technology that would empower workers and citizens. But at the end, what I showed you is the opposite happened. Digital technologies went in a very automation direction, and in fact, we've done much less of the reinstatement. Why? Well, it's impossible to know and impossible to prove, But a lot of historical qualitative evidence suggests that 3 sets of factors played a role. One is that around the same time, a new view among businesses emerged. It is captured by what some economists discuss as the Friedman doctrine, the view that Milton Friedman advocated, that the business of business is to maximize profits for shareholders, and he himself called it the Friedman doctrine. And it was, in particular, became a mantra for managers to cut wages while boosting profits. But of course, how do you cut wages? You can only go so far by bargaining wages down. You need technology to do it, and digital technologies became particularly useful. This would have been very difficult to do in the heyday of United Auto Workers, because unions would have opposed it. But by this time, unions were in decline because blue-collar work was declining, but also the political change, especially with the Reagan Revolution, further weakened unions. So lack of countervailing power made it easier for this path to be followed. And at the same time, a new vision, very different from the hacker ethic of the 1960s, emerged in the tech industry that really prioritized automation. All of these things coming together, they brought digital technologies in a direction that was much more focused on automation. Now, there are some bits of this that I can provide evidence for, but since I'm running out of time, let me skip the evidence, and let me just conclude by saying 3 final things. The first is that what started with digital technologies is now continuing with artificial intelligence. The path of artificial intelligence is going very much in an automation direction, and if so, it has the promise, it is very much still a promise stage, but it has the promise of expanding automation into a broader range of tasks. And if my interpretation of automation, especially without countervailing powers, is correct, that could create even worse distributional consequences. But once again, just like with digital technologies, there is no reason for artificial intelligence to go this way. In fact, the very framing of machine intelligence, artificial intelligence, is partly ideological. The view that machines should be intelligent and autonomous was not the way that most computer scientists thought. It was actually Turing's view, which many in the AI field adopted. But many of the pioneers of the field in the 1950s and 60s thought very differently. And I would summarize their view as machine usefulness. Machines should be useful to humans, not autonomous intelligence objects. And there are today many applications of digital technologies that are going quite productive directions that show that machine usefulness prospect is real, but they are quite marginal to the field. My focus so far has been on the developed world, but I want to add that the implications of these for the developing world could be quite major. And in particular, if new digital technologies go more and more in an automation direction, those would be technologies that are highly inappropriate to the needs of the developing world, because the developing world is scarce in engineers, designers, and capital, and is abundant in middle-skill labor. But if you develop technologies to automate middle-skill labor, that means that's exactly the wrong kind of technology for many billion people around the world. Now, political change was a very important part of it, and unfortunately, we are doing badly politically as well. Democracy is much weaker, trust in institutions is much lower, and I think we have to really question whether that's completely independent from these technological trends, both because of their indirect effects through inequality and the direct effects of tech companies' impact on communication technologies, especially based on a business model that very much fits onto the things that I've explained before. Low labor cost, highly automated, highly controlled environments in which communication and information exchange are being structured. Let me conclude by saying that all of this is not a lament about the future being bad. Exactly like what I tried to explain with my emphasis of the British Industrial Revolution, I think what makes this potentially interesting is that the direction of technology is malleable, so we can redirect it. There are examples, both from history and from the present, where even modest societal pressure and government policy have been quite successful in redirecting technological change. Especially, we see that in solar and green energy, for example, most recently. And I think the same can be done when it comes to the balance between automation and worker-friendly technologies, as well as communication technologies more broadly. Thank you very much.
So we do have some time for questions and answers with the speaker. If any of you would like to have questions for the speaker, please feel free to stick around. I will walk around with the mic, and you have a mic on the other end as well. So if you have any questions for the speaker, please do stick around.
Hi, Daron. Thanks for this talk. This is a good question. In terms of automation versus creating new technical jobs, you gave the example of Germany and Japan in terms of creating new jobs. So could we argue that while America didn't do so, America actually benefited?
America, sorry?
America benefited relative to Germany and Japan because in the 90s and 2000s, Japan had an anemic growth, and Germany did post-unification in 2000. So when you talk about how do you kind of match that with
It's a great question, and in fact, we do spend quite some time with that Germany-US contrast in the book, precisely because actually Germany has been ahead of the United States in terms of introducing robots, partly because of demographic trends. It has aged much faster than the United States, and that aging has triggered more rapid robot adoption. However, Germany has, for a variety of reasons, adopted a very different approach. While robots have been introduced, that's been embedded in a very different institutional context, stronger worker representation both in terms of union bargaining and work councils, and an apprenticeship system that creates long-term relationships between employers and employees. And what you see is quite an interesting pattern. First of all, from an empirical point of view, when German companies introduce robots, they cut down on blue-collar work, so blue-collar wages and blue-collar employment goes down, but they promote some of those blue-collar workers, quite a few of them, actually to more technical occupation, to more white-collar occupation. So overall employment goes down much less or not at all in Germany. And wages for these workers actually increase. They have also used a lot of technology in order to create new tasks. For example, they have used software to create more person-centered design, inspection, and reprogramming tasks at the same time as robotization. As a result, their macroeconomic trends are very complicated. I think there are two big issues that make Germany quite difficult to compare. One is reunification, the other one is the euro. But productivity in the car manufacturing has been much better in Germany than in the United States. So there are several other examples. I think each example has its own peculiarity, but there are several other examples when firms go in the direction of automation, but combined with other things that bring more worker training and more worker tasks, the results have generally been not bad for companies and quite good for workers.
First, I want to say thank you for the talk and how you're very open meeting. Second, my question is, if we're thinking about automation displacing workers, to what extent does or doesn't that encourage entrepreneurs to then try to make the most of the now very abundant factor? Is there evidence that over the very long run there is a little bit of self-correction, or is it all that come from unions and government, et cetera?
That's a great question. And in fact, one of the early papers I wrote in this area with Pasquale Restrepo was exactly a theoretical exploration of that before some of these empirical papers that I have summarized here. And indeed, your intuition is exactly right. There are forces, theoretical forces, that seem to be not just theoretical, but not substantially present, that if the labor share goes down a lot because of automation, that makes creating new tasks more profitable. The problem is that that is not a strong enough force that can always act. So in particular, there are two limits to it. One is that that force is there, but it will never be the efficient amount. And the reason for that is especially easy to see when you have, say, for example, labor market rents. And that's because a social planner doesn't care about the wage that you get, it cares about the social opportunity cost of labor. But if wages are above that social opportunity cost, firms will always have excessive incentives to automate. The second is that even when that force is there, other things may dominate, so you can even in the presence of that force, you can go to an equilibrium in which labor is completely eliminated. Not that we're ever going there at the moment. I mean, the numbers that I showed you from robots, they're like 1% decline in employment, so that's not going to take us to a jobless future, anytime soon. But those forces could be theoretically much more powerful than what you pointed out, but what you pointed out is exactly on target.
Other questions? Yes.
How much of the issue you just raised can be solved by redistribution of the wealth instead of redirecting technologies? Say the government does a great job of collecting taxes and redistributing the workers' job or from the labor could be reduced, but or if overall productivity could be a different way of solving the
Right.
issue.
Great question, a very, very important question. And I want to take that very seriously, but let me take it to the extreme first, which may not be fair, because when you take something to an extreme, sort of it's easier to bring it down. But last year, a book came out by one of the advisors to Jeremy Corbyn, and I think if I give you the title, you can guess what's inside the book. It's a good title. I'm not sure about the book, but the title is good. The title of the book is Fully Automated Luxury Communism, and the idea is, we're going to be so good at automating everything that we can create a new communist society where we give abundance to everybody, a la Marx, communism, everybody according to their needs. We can do that because we're going to automate everything. Now, there are three problems with that. One is that we're not heading there. As I showed you, the productivity gains from just automation are not that great. So I think there is a productivity imperative for making better use of workers. So in other words, I think the Friedman doctrine was wrong in so many ways. But one of its most pernicious effects was to condition firms to think of labor as a cost. But labor is a resource. And in a very simple model, perhaps resource and cost doesn't make much difference. But when technology is a choice, resource and cost is very different. Because if you view it as a cost, you try to cut it. If it's a resource, you try to make it more productive. Second, even if we could generate a lot of abundance, the political economy of it doesn't work. Do you think Elon Musk is going to be enthusiastic about taking 90% of his wealth and redistribute it to everybody when he already thinks that he's so brilliant that he deserves even more money? So I think more money concentrated in the hands of a few entrepreneurs also goes with a lot of political power, and that political power is going to stand on the way of redistribution. But third, and this is most interesting for others to investigate in the future, it's not even clear that that's what people would want. So for most of our history, which has not been always happy, labor market has been where most people earn their living, and that's where they define their social existence, even when they're not happy with that. And there is mounting evidence, but it's very disparate, it's very decentralized, comes bits and pieces, that people really don't want just money. They want some social purpose. And I think if it is possible to create new jobs that are meaningful and investing in people, investing in their training, investing in new tasks, I think that could be, at least in the medium term, socially more constructive as well.
Any other questions?
Do you think that it's possible that as AI gets better and gets closer to crossing the uncanny valley and passing the Turing test, that it could change the kind of jobs that humans work like on the scale that the internet did?
Yeah, I think, I'm glad you gave the example of the internet, because I think internet is one of the instances where you have the best kind of human-machine collaboration. What is the internet? The internet is a system for codifying and making it easier to classify information that humans generate. So it's not a machine intelligence project. If it was a machine intelligence project, machines would generate the information. But today, still, after decades of billions of dollars of spending on machine intelligence, almost everything that's interesting on the internet is human generated, and the internet makes it easier for us. Okay, there are many bad aspects of the internet, but it is actually one of the ways in which we can use digital technologies for more human-friendly tasks is to collate, organize information, to create new platforms. So if you look at, for example, things like M-Pesa in Kenya, which is a digital currency system, it is not an automation system. It is extremely productive because it has provided new tools for humans to do, and that would not have been possible without cell phones. Now with digital technologies, it's spreading, that kind of technology is spreading very successfully. Or things like Airbnb. They are again ways of using technologies to create platforms for bringing humans together so that humans can engage in better interactions. Again, not completely dissimilar to the internet. So I think there are many uses, many avenues for that sort of machine intelligence, but that's not necessarily the business model of Google, Amazon, or Facebook, for example.
Thank you. Towards the end, you touched on developing countries as well and what it means for development. And so I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about that. And do you see a role for developing countries, or do you think whatever gets, you say there's a path and either you go through something that favors labor or not? Do you think that developing countries are then subject to just taking in mostly the technologies that are developed, or do you think there is, but because the world is so connected, or is there a path in which developing countries can fight back with their own more augmenting technologies that?
So thank you very much. That's an excellent question, and it's something I've also tried to write on over the last few years. I think that is also a choice. Right now, developing countries are completely disorganized, and this is not an issue that is on their radar. So as a result, the default position is exactly what you described at the end, which is that there's a path of technology determined mostly by the US and China, perhaps a little bit by Europe, and developing countries are going to take whatever is dished out to them. But I think that need not be the case. If developing countries can organize and start putting pressure through international organizations, resources, I think they can have an impact on the direction of technology. It will not be easy. At the moment, the amount of resources and attention to that will never reach, even if you combine Brazil, India, Turkey, Indonesia, it's not going to reach where it is in China. But I think creating a quadrupolar or multipolar world in which the developing country is present as a force in the direction of technology is actually very important.
I was thinking what you were saying earlier about the political economy and redistribution being somewhat difficult. And I guess my question is, going back when you earlier were talking about kind of these declines in democratic norms. My question is to what extent, and obviously you were saying that organized labor can help to direct technological progress in a way that's labor augmenting rather than labor replacing. But to what extent is the fact that it seems like globalization and automation is increasing the popularity of right-wing populist parties, kind of saying that now, for whatever reason, this way of automation is encouraging a different type of political framework organization than the previous ways of automation. How can we get around that?
Right. I think that's another critical question. That's the topic of 1.5 chapters in the book. Simplifying it, what I just said about industrial liberation, the second phase of the industrial revolution, was that political factors and democratization, or greater democracy, greater worker participation, was critical for redirecting the direction of progress. And today, exactly like you said, we are going through one of the worst periods for democracy. So that seems like a double whammy. So it's really bad. Now, the problem is we don't fully understand what's going on with democracy. Some of it is the indirect effects of inequality. I mean, it is, where are you seeing all of these things? Italy. Italy has had no growth and declines in the real incomes of low education Italians for 40 years. The United States, 40-year decline, as you saw. France, increasing unemployment for youth of all sorts. So these economic hardships are building up grievances. Second, for reasons that we can get into, there's a huge swing towards nationalism, which, of course, is the handmaiden of right-wing authoritarianism in this instance. And technology is not helping. So I didn't have time to get into it, but the direction of technology when it comes to social media or general communication technologies is even more blatantly a choice, and a very peculiar choice. So there is no reason, again, this is not, if there was a Meta representative here, they would vehemently disagree. But there is no reason for digital technologies to be used in this way of social media. Digital ad-based business models are certainly nothing preordained, and they're not the only way of organizing how these companies work. They're a very profitable way of organizing it, but they're also a very pernicious way of organizing it, which makes these companies monopolize a huge amount of data and use that data for manipulation. But I don't think it is a coincidence that you have a tremendous amount of hate speech misinformation on Facebook, Twitter, Reddit, but you don't have any of it in Wikipedia. Or you don't have any of it on Netflix. Netflix collects a lot of information about you, but then it doesn't use that information to send you political messages that will get you crazy and start hating the left-wingers or the right-wingers, because they have a very different business model. They want your subscription. So I think these business models are critical about how we use technology and what we communicate with, and that communication is also key for the future of democracy. Again, we come back to choice and direction of technology.